Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you all for joining the Environmental Justice Action Task Force Equity Analysis Subcommittee. This is our second Equity Analysis Subcommittee meeting. And as many of you know, at our last Equity Analysis Subcommittee meeting, we did elect two chairs, Beatriz Soto and Renee Milar-Chacon. And we are really excited to have them kind of take the reins on these meetings moving forward. So Beatriz and Renee, I will go ahead and turn it over to you all to kind of just get started with our meeting and begin facilitating. And so if you all want to kind of introduce yourselves, maybe Beatriz and then Renee, you want to kind of kick us off with a land acknowledgement, that would be great.
Well, thank you everybody for electing me and Renee. We're very proud to be the co-chairs and to be helping Joel and Lubna and all of our team think about the equity analysis. My name is Beatriz Soto. I am representing disproportionately impacted communities from Colorado District 3 on the western slope. It's basically all the west part of Colorado, even kind of down into Pueblo. So thank you very much.
Subcommittee, thank you, Beatriz. Thank you all. I am very humbled and very honored to be in this space, as always. My name is Renee Milar-Chacon. I'm Dene Chicana and Filipina from the homelands of the Ute, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, the Lakota, the Navajo, the Shoshone, the Comanche, and 48 tribes that still live and travel through this space, which is also the Ute Trail, one of the oldest known intersections on this continent that we actually call Turtle Island. We recognize this because it is time to be good ancestors in this space. And with that, I try my best as a mother to represent disproportionately impacted communities in Commerce City, Ward 3, specifically around Henderson. It's a responsibility I hope all of us can take together in a transformative way, as we also have to look at ourselves where we hold certain projections and biases too, to be able to truly heal. And I'm grateful in any way that I can bridge in being able to heal communities, especially disproportionately impacted communities first.
Great, thank you, Renee. And for our interpreters, Maite and Jasmine, if you would want to kick us off with the language justice statement, and then we can go ahead and enable interpretation.
Of course, thank you all. So hi everyone, I'm Jasmine. I'm here with my colleague Maite, and we're here from the Community Language Cooperative to help facilitate a space of language justice. So essentially, I'm so sorry, my nephew seems to be playing in the background. We are here to facilitate a space of language justice. So basically, we want folks to be able to participate in the language of their hearts. And so we're activating the simultaneous interpretation function after I finish this intro. At that point, you will see a globe pop up at the bottom of your screen that says interpretation. If you're joining us from a cell phone or a tablet, you can find this option on the menu with the three dots that says more. Either way, it's the same. If you're not fully bilingual in English and in Spanish, please go ahead and select that preferred language. We also ask that y'all keep in mind your pace and your clarity. Please take your time with your words. And if you're having any issues with your interpretation function, always feel free to send us a message via the chat. We'll be happy to help that way. I'm going to repeat this in Spanish now. Hola, buenas tardes. Mi nombre es Yasmín. Estoy aquí junto con mi colega Maite. Estamos aquí de la CLC para facilitar un espacio de justicia de lenguaje. Básicamente queremos que todos puedan participar en el idioma de su corazón. Entonces, para facilitar esto, vamos a activar la función de interpretación simultánea. En cuanto termine esta presentación, vamos a encender esa función y van a ver un globo en la parte inferior de la pantalla que dice interpretación. Si nos acompañan desde un celular, encontrarán esta opción en el menú con los tres puntitos que dice More o que dice Más. Igual es lo mismo si no son completamente bilingües en inglés y en español, por favor elijan ese idioma preferido. Les pedimos que también tengan en mente su velocidad y su claridad. Tomen su tiempo con sus palabras y si en algún momento están teniendo alguna dificultad con la interpretación, nos pueden enviar mensaje con el chat, por el chat y con mucho gusto les ayudamos. Creo que sería todo y vamos a comenzar. I think that is everything else. We can go ahead and start interpretation. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Jasmine. I've went ahead and started the interpretation, and this meeting will also be recorded in Spanish, just as a heads up. Okay, so Renee, if you could maybe lead us in a roll call just to see who's here and who's absent, and then take us into a quick icebreaker for our task force members. Thank you.
Sweet. So I'm going to go ahead and start with the roll call. Go ahead and say if you're here. Arthur Ortegon. Ortegon.
There you go. Here we go. I'm here.
Doug Dean.
I'm here.
Ian Tafoya.
Present.
Gary Arnold. Gary.
I don't think Gary's on. Yeah.
Hilda Nucete. Hilda.
I don't think she's on yet either.
No worries. Jamie Valdez.
I am here. I'm going to be switching devices in just a moment.
No worries. Thank you, Jamie. Jordan Beasley.
Here.
Thank you. Kimberly Mendoza Cook. Marcia Nielsen. Marcia Nielsen. Mira Flickling.
Here.
Thank you. Trisha Oath.
Yep, I'm here.
Thank you. And Tyson Johnston.
Present.
Sweet. Thank you, love. So moving to the icebreaker, tell us something unique about yourself. Only task force members for the sake of time. So I will go first. I'm a Samadora in Danza Azteca. So I teach Aztec dancing through holding the smoke. And we teach normally the little ones first. I will forward it to Mira.
Sure. Mira Fickling. And my unique thing, I used to be into obstacle course racing. I guess I will pass it to Emily.
I think
Sorry, I
Emily.
couldn't find my unmute. I'm not a task force member, so I will kick it to Trisha.
Hi, everybody. So I guess I would say I've taken cooking classes in a lot of places around the world. But one thing I really like to make is tagine, and so I have a goal to get to Morocco and take a class and really perfect my tagines. All right, let's see, Beatriz.
Thank you, Trisha. So I played field hockey with the Mexican youth team, and I was able to play in the Youth Olympics in Mexico when I was 18. So I played field hockey, and I will pass it on to Tyson.
All right. I'll put a couple things out there real quick, just because I think I may have said the first one, but I am 7 foot tall, or used to be anyways. I'm starting to shrink. I'm down to about 6'11" now. Sometimes you can't tell by the camera, but as I run into other task force members outside of this, they kind of look at me and go, well, I wasn't expecting you to be so tall. So that's my one little thing, and I'll just leave it at that, because I think maybe not everybody knew that. And I'll pass it to Doug. Have you gone?
Not yet.
All right.
I'm Doug Dean. Sitting here trying to think of anything unique. I guess one unique thing is that I was the only freshman in the history of my senior high school to get a varsity letter in football. And I weighed 114 pounds that year. I'll pass it on to Jordan.
Thanks, Doug. Yeah, struggling to think of the unique item here. I perhaps might be the only person that met my wife on a ski race. So that's really unique. Let's see. Wasn't keeping a tally of who's gone and who hasn't gone. All right.
I can go. I haven't been called yet, if that makes it easier.
Go ahead, Ian. Thanks.
Yeah, Ian Thomas Savoya. Something unique about me. Well, my birthday's Earth Day, but you were talking about sports stuff, and so I'm a Colorado State champion in ultimate frisbee. My senior year, we went undefeated. Hi, man. I don't think you've gone yet.
Thanks, Ian. I don't know how unique it is, but I guess a couple things about me. I am an archer and a percussionist. Oh, and I'm on my phone, so I can't tell who's gone and who hasn't. So if someone can help me out, I'd appreciate it.
I think I might be the last one. I'm not sure. Arthur Ortegon. Something unique about me is a hobby I inherited from my father is something called lepidoptery, which is the study and collection of butterflies, which is taking me to all 7 continents to study those little fast bugs. And so, yeah, I don't know who else this should go back to. Lumna?
Are there any task force members that are on that we missed that haven't gone yet? I believe we've covered everyone.
I can take it, Lubna, just so we can kind of keep rolling and give an update. Well, thank you everybody for sharing something unique about yourselves. I guess that helps us build community, even though we're on this kind of Zoom platform, right? So a little bit, I'm just going to speak a little bit about what we talked about last meeting, and then kind of just making sure, you know, we're overviewing how we work together and what our objectives are. And then we're going to do a quick overview of our agenda today, since me and Renee are going to be kind of leading this meeting along with Joel and Lumna. So in our last meeting, we were really working around just the scope of our work and our objectives and asking some big questions about what a cumulative impact analysis is, who benefits from it, which agencies it should apply to. And I don't think we've come to any of those conclusions necessarily. And I think this is still part of the process that we are going through, and we are hoping to work together to answer some of these questions. We did task Joel and Lubna to please give us kind of a chart of the different state agencies and the power structures, and we created a survey to send to these different agencies to further understand this and understand if they do anything like an equity analysis or something similar. So we don't have to start from scratch reinventing the wheel, but better understanding kind of what is out there and helping us make better and more informed decisions as we move forward. The intent of this, I think we're still also kind of trying to answer that question. Something that we all have, I think, agreed to and concluded to is that we are not doing an equity analysis. What we want to do is make sure that we define what an equity analysis looks like and make suggestions of what that is. And then also, who is that targeting, right? And something that I think we've talked about in this group is that we don't want it to be too lengthy or a process that is extremely tedious. That's going to sit on a shelf, and we want to make it something that is effective and that hopefully has some teeth and accountability behind it. And I think that's kind of what we've concluded. And then also seeing how this continues to grow and how it can be something that continually is fed information. Please, anybody stop me if you guys think I'm missing something. So kind of our agenda today, we have two special guests this afternoon that we hope help inform what an equity analysis means, and some that have already been done at a federal level and at a state level, that will help us have conversation around these and ask questions about what information is out there, what these processes look like, and hopefully spark some interesting ideas and some discussion amongst us. And then always please kind of remember that at the end of the day, we're tasked with empowering disproportionately impacted communities to have a better future and a healthier future, right, overall. Our guests are going to be Charles Lee. He works with the EPA in Region 8. And then we're also going to have Anna McDevitt later today with the Sierra Club, and she did a cumulative impact in an area in Pueblo that we think might be a good guiding point, and we can ask her some questions about how that went for her as well. And then later in the night, we're also going to have Joel kind of get back to us with the survey and all the information that the Equity Action Board has been working on, our staff, so we can ask them questions as well. So they're going to be reporting back on the survey as well as the diagrams of the different agencies and the power structures. Yeah, and I think I've kind of got everything, right, Lumna? Do you think I'm missing anything? And there will be opportunities for us to ask questions to the panelists as well. So we encourage you guys to take notes and ask any questions. This is intended to be an educational session and as well an opportunity to maybe have some questions answered that we might have. Ian, go ahead.
Sorry, my camera's off. My internet's lagging. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. I just want to follow up to make sure, as I recall, we also asked the agencies for what permitting and planning decisions they make and what policies or guidelines or procedures guide them in that work beyond just if they have an equity analysis done before.
And that was part of the survey, right, Joel? Please correct me if I'm wrong. So we are going to hear from that as well, Ian.
Yes, Beatriz, that's correct. That was part of the survey. So I tried to condense a lot of information down for you all that we got in response to the survey and in answering all of those questions that you both discussed.
Thank you.
And then after we have our presentations at 5:30, we're going to have 30 minutes for public comment. So I hope all of you can stick around for that portion of the conversation as well. So we are right on time. Charles, are we ready to kick it off for Charles to start his presentation?
Yeah, that'd be great. And Charles, maybe you could just introduce yourself a bit and feel free to share your screen if you want to do a presentation that way, or if you want to do something more informal, that's totally fine too.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. I'm Charles Lee. I'm the Senior Policy Advisor for Environmental Justice, working out of the headquarter office of EJ. And some of you may know I have a long history looking at EJ from many years ago. And so this issue of cumulative impacts is really a important pivotal issue and one that I think people call, and I'll refer to it as a holy grail for environmental justice. And I think we can get to this in the conversation when, I'd be really interested to know what you are thinking about when you say equity analysis. Equity analysis and cumulative impact analysis are maybe I think are interrelated, not necessarily all the same. So just wanted to kind of throw that out there for everyone to think about. So I can just share my screen. Does that do it?
There we go.
How's that?
Yep.
Good. Okay, so let me bring this up. Okay, so I will give the context of this presentation as I go along, but we've been thinking about this issue for a while, and there was a assessment done around barriers to equity at EPA, and one of the findings was about how the lack of an approach towards cumulative impacts really has presented a barrier to equity, and so and so this is some of the background to this. I started to think about this issue in great depth for several months now. Not to say that this has not been a major area of interest throughout the past several years, but more in depth in terms of what this may mean for EPA going forward. And so I wanted to start this discussion with some definitions around cumulative impacts, and there are several, the highlights of which are presented on this slide. I start with the one from California EPA. This was the one that was codified in 2005. So that's a good 15 years ago, talking about how cumulative impacts means exposures, public health or environmental effects from combined emissions and discharges from all sources, and also taking into account sensitive populations and socioeconomic factors. So in large measure, this talks about cumulative impacts as a combination of environmental stressors or pollution burdens with population vulnerability. And that, I think, is a classic construct for thinking about cumulative impacts. One of the reasons I highlight this definition is that it came from the communities themselves in California. It was the recommendation of the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee, and which focused on two major issues, very much interrelated. One of which has to do with cumulative impacts, and then the other one having to do with precautionary approaches. Recently, with the emphasis on cumulative impacts within the Biden administration and under the leadership of Administrator Regan, the Office of Research and Development came up with a operational definition. So this is not a formal definition by EPA, but it was one that was developed to be operational for the purposes of developing a research agenda around cumulative impacts. This is in the throes of the Office of Research and Development's, I think, triennial or every 4-year strategic research action plans development. So that is setting the research agenda for all the newness of the Office of Research and Development for the next 3 to 4 years. And this talks about cumulative impacts in terms of being total burden, positive, neutral, or negative from chemical, non-chemical, and taking place over time, at a given point in time or over a period of time. And this is very similar in terms of just understanding, like in California, and the community perspective on this reflects this idea of total burden. The other one that I just wanted to add to the mix is the one from NEPA, and of course that's also reflected in all the state environmental policy acts in terms of cumulative impacts coming from. It reflects a lot of some of these other things, but also the idea is incremental impact for actions when added to past, present, or reasonably foreseeable future action. So this really emphasizes then the temporal nature of cumulative impacts. So one, from a definitional standpoint, there's been a lot of conversations about cumulative impacts, and I thought it'd be good cumulative impact and
porque el
related.
impacto acumulativo y los conceptos relacionados empezó a ayudar para hablar de qué es el impacto acumulativo y lo que no es. Entonces, para reiterar algunas de estas definiciones, es la carga total, incluye lo químico y lo no químico, que incluye los determinantes sociales de la salud, varios contaminantes, varias fuentes, varias exposiciones, varios medios, varias vías, incluye los impactos en la calidad de vida. Y esto es muy importante cuando empezamos a hablar de esto como más que algo que se relacione con la ley ambiental, pero también con la ley de derechos civiles. Incluye las cargas negativas, neutrales y positivas, y es clave para entender los impactos desproporcionados y también
stressors, current and past stressors and burdens, including impacts of the historic racism, like redlining, other such processes. What it is not risk assessment, and the idea of cumulative impacts historically came about as a critique of risk assessment. That harkens back to that conversation I talked about in terms of the development of the definition in California. It is not comparative risk. It is not aggregate exposures, which talks about essentially one pollutant and all the ways that a human being is exposed to that. Multiple pollutant approaches, which like in EPA, there's a lot of multiple pollutant approaches, particularly emerging, particularly in the air context, where they're looking at ozone and PM and NOx and SOx together, multimedia approaches, and then there's this idea of cumulative risk assessment, which has been in development with rather in a slow pace since the EPA issued the framework for cumulative risk assessment back in 2003. So I make note of it is important to make these distinctions because they're not the same thing, and especially they're not the same things from the point of view of communities. But there's also another way of looking at all these different things that I just kind of listed, which there's a certain amount of complementing of each other in terms of concepts, because risk assessment has evolved to begin to move from looking at single pollutants from a single source to a lot of looking at community health and environment in total, and different takes on that. And so like I said here, they reflect evolving thinking and may complement each other. So what has EPA been doing? I kind of prefaced this talk by saying how EPA has been thinking a lot about this issue of cumulative impacts, especially during the past year or so, and the conclusion that the lack of such a coherent cross-agency coordinated approach is a major barrier to achieving equity and environmental justice, and that as a result, we've committed to developing a framework for considering cumulative impacts and relevant EPA decisions and operationalizing that framework in programs, our programs and activities. And this is a priority action for EPA. So the other kinds of activities has been
las otras clases de actividades que se han llevado a cabo es el EPA, como saben, en el 2010 hizo o publicó algo llamado el EJ Legal Tools Document, o el documento de herramientas legales, y también tendrá una atención enfocada para que consideren y aborden los impactos acumulativos, y el EPA también se compromete a aclarar cómo considerar el impacto acumulativo en pautas futuras para implementar.
1964. Some of you may have been involved in the Office of Research Development as part of this research planning process that I spoke about recently. Hosted a series of listening sessions with states, tribes, and local government agencies, academic experts, and community leaders as part of a set of workshops to develop thinking about cumulative impacts and research planning. A white paper was released or was issued about a couple of weeks ago. It's on the EPA website on cumulative impacts and research planning, and we just held a consultation with the Science Advisory Board on the issue. And I think tapes or recordings of those sessions are available. We are also working in partnership with state and local agencies to advance analysis of disproportionate and cumulative impacts. I'll highlight one of them later, having to do with the recent permit decision by the Chicago Department of Public Health on this.
De Salud Pública de Chicago en general. Estas son actividades, algo de antecedentes que me parecen importantes en cómo tomamos en cuenta este asunto de impacto acumulativo.
In a comprehensive way. It is definitely important to note that cumulative impact assessment has been going on for a while. And this is the result reflected in the development of what I call second generation EJ mapping and screening tools. These are the ones that combine environmental and social factors. The first example of this is California's CalEnviro screen. Another example is EPA's EJ screen. So an important distinction: California's EJ CalEnviro screen does combine all the stressors together, all the indicators together, and come up with a cumulative score. And then you can rank every census tract in the state of California accordingly. EJ screen does not do that. But because its architecture is really cumulative in nature, there are a lot of different ways that you can start to array the data so you can see a full picture of the community in a cumulative manner. So what we realized, and so this is what's then reflected in this graphic that was in my article recently in the Environmental Law Reporter on confronting disproportionate impact and systemic racism in environmental policy. And this is the whole idea of fit for purpose, and the idea that there is a continuum in terms of the type of analysis, the scale analysis, the degree of quantification that's needed to support certain types of decisions. So these are multiple. So environmental justice and cumulative impacts and disproportionate impact all fall along the type of decision that's necessary, fall along a certain continuum. And they go from more voluntary or more flexible, more discretionary, if you will, to more regulatory types of functions, which are more rigid, less flexible, and more mechanistic in nature. And so in the beginning, we thought of these mapping tools and screening tools as only useful for doing outreach, identifying places for to do outreach or further analysis. And actually, the release of CalEnviro screen and EJ screen both have very strong statements saying that these are only for that purpose. and not to be used for risk assessment or regulatory decisions. We then learned as things evolved, and this also took place in California, was the passage of the Senate Bill 535, which dedicated that 25% of the greenhouse gas reduction funds should go into quote unquote disadvantaged communities, and how we was one to determine what they were, and that was to be CalEnviro screening. And what that opened up was a whole new area in terms of use of cumulative impact tools in a very significant way. And that's for allocation of resources, or in some ways, where does government invest in resources? And certainly California, that has led to billions of dollars of funding. In other states like New York State and Illinois, they're following the same model. In the federal government, there is now the Justice 40 initiative, which directs that 40% of federal resources from a group of programs will flow to disadvantaged communities. And along this, in much the same way, in terms of allocation or prioritization of resources, is the prioritization of program attention for things like enforcement priorities, where you focus your targeting for, say, inspections or location of monitors and other program activities. Now, as you get into the more regulatory context, like permitting and rulemaking, we are going to have greater degrees of more in-depth, more refined analysis. That these snapshots of communities, may not be sufficient. Not that they can't be used in some way, shape, or form, but they're probably not going to be sufficient to make those types of decisions. And so we're, part of the efforts of EPA going forward is to figure out how to go beyond building on this. So, we want to make sure that people understand that we're not starting from zero, that we're building on these screening tools, but we need to go beyond them, particularly for regulatory decision context. So that gives a foundation for how we want to go forward. How to think about this issue of cumulative impacts. I think, like I said, and so this is beginning to frame a larger context for understanding this cumulative impacts. A lot of people say, you ever heard the term wicked problem? Cumulative impacts is definitely a wicked problem. But that, it is the holy grail of EJ. And, that there are systemic factors in society that have driven the disproportionate concentration of environmental burdens and population vulnerability in people of color, indigenous, and low-income communities. That that these didn't pop out of nowhere, but these are factors that range from a number of sources that I would talk about in a second, that kind of like systematically drive the result in the systematic and disproportionate concentration. And so cumulative impacts is very much interrelated. The idea of disproportionate impacts and environmental inequity, but they are really much more than that. So we know that this is all talked about over and over again, where when you find certain communities, these are concentrations of environmental burdens and population vulnerabilities. People call them sacrifice zones. They're, when you do analyses, if you find one type of environmental burden, and there are people of color or low-income indigenous communities, it's likely they're going to have a whole multiple sets of them. So, so this pattern, is really the crux of the question. I mean, it's certainly the evidence that this exists is incontrovertible and unacceptable. And this, is a result of many factors, including, our very siloed one pollutant at a time approach to environmental protection, and two, and there's a whole range of factors in between, vestiges of systemic racism and historic discrimination in land use decision making. So there's no easy fix here. It will involve multiple decisions and multiple authorities from multiple agencies. And so the other point that we want to make, and this now focuses on, you want to use it as an example of the recent decision by the Chicago Department of Public Health around the permit application for a metal recycling facility, scrap metal recycling facility that would be relocated from a wealthy white neighborhood to the predominantly Black and Latinx Southeast side. And so, this actually resulted in the Department of Public Health in Chicago denying the permit. There's a lot to be said about that, and we don't need to go into all the details. And I can certainly send people the the link to a lot of these to this report and other documents. But I wanted to use it as a way to illustrate, how the overlays between environmental justice and civil rights are reflected in this issue of cumulative impacts. And certainly, these are the conclusions of this study, that, racial inequities can be perpetrated through policies like zoning and permitting, and that there is an understanding of the social and structural and social determinants of disproportionate impacts must be considered within the assessment of cumulative impacts, particularly when it's occurring within already overburdened communities. And the way that they did the analysis is a mix or a blend of traditional environmental and health risk assessment with emerging cumulative impact analysis, which I kind of gave a little bit of background on, and emerging or best practices in racial equity impact assessment. And this is really an analysis of who benefits from a decision or program, or who bears the burden of a decision or a program. And so this will lead to a more holistic view of potential impacts, and how that either reduces, maintains, or increases racial equity. So there's a lot to dig in here. But one of the things that I think that when we start to think about cumulative impacts, particularly in this regulatory context, is that it's going to be a lot more need to have a refined set of type of analysis, and that is not going to be simply that the cumulative impacts methodologies that we have developed already are good for certain parts of this analysis, but not necessarily sufficient. And these other approaches may be very useful. But all in all, this whole point here is to really draw the link between the fact that, this is both an environmental justice and a civil rights issue. So, where are we at, or what is the starting point for discussing this? Certainly, there is a need to understand that this is that we're all in this together, that it involves every level of government, plays an important role. We need to start with a sense of shared values and shared knowledge. So a lot of things I talked about, how do we understand the issue of cumulative impacts and its relationship to equity is really part of that base of shared values. We have a lot to build on already, like I said, in terms of strategies, methods, and data, but we need to go beyond them, and cumulative impacts of both the civil rights and EJ issue, and we're going to have to learn from each other in tackling this problem, which is in fact a truly a wicked issue, a wicked problem, and it certainly speaks to the need for new ways, much more holistic ways of carrying out our environmental protection mission. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Charles. I really appreciate your presentation. I was in a meeting earlier today, and they asked us to close our eyes and imagine a world in 10 years, and what would that look like, right? And I just imagine, every child in Colorado, every family being able to live a full life and full health and not being sacrificed for the benefit of others. I was kind of laughed at, but I just wanted to share it to the space that, I think if we dream it and we start working towards it, we might be able to get there together. So I want to open this opportunity up for discussion from the commission members. This is not public comment. We're not at that point yet. I just wanted to clarify that we will be there at 5:30. And yeah, so let's kick it off and see if anybody from the commission has some questions.
And Charles, feel free to stop your screen share if you'd like, so you can kind of get back into the
okay. How do I do that now?
I think there should be a
stop share. There it goes. There it goes.
Go ahead, Ian.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. I think that those definitions were really good. There was a part in the conversation where you were talking about Cal EnviroScreen and it having its limitations and it not really being enough of a guide in regulatory proceedings. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that specific component and if there's any advanced work and what comes next.
Well, I was saying that the context in which that statement was made was that we all thought that these screening tools or these mapping and screening tools were only for use in terms of just identifying areas where we can, where we can do more analysis or outreach, and that we did not associate at that point the fact that those tools and that level of information was actually useful or could be used to inform really significant decisions. So that was the context for it, right? So the question then is, having been able to use that for those types of decisions, mainly in the prioritization of program attention and resources arena, how much of this can be used in much more in a regulatory context, or what parts of this can be of these methodologies and data can be used in a more regulatory context. And so, the other piece of this is just giving you a snapshot of what was done in Chicago, opens up a whole bunch of other kind of ways in which different kinds of analysis could be used together.
I have a question. How much qualitative data that had cultural or trauma sensitivity did you use in these spaces? Often we see communities that have lack of access to healthcare, housing, especially for Indigenous communities or in spaces like that it's only seen often to focus on voters, almost discriminatory specifically towards immigrant communities or Indigenous communities or those that are harder to represent and create data gaps. How much qualitative?
I think that's a really, really, really important part of this, it's, in fact, one of the, as we're building out this framework, one of the big parts of that is the use of qualitative data. And the use of qualitative data, certainly one part of that is a traditional ecological knowledge, but also, and community knowledge. And how do you start to do that in combination with quantitative data so that, you know, you have a firmer, much more solid way to root your decisions so that they will stand up. So I think the answer is definitely yes. You know, I had, you know, it's definitely yes. And so there's a lot more there. There's also, you know, part of this whole effort is, you know, community science or citizens and community science, and how that should be brought into the picture as far as, you know, how to inform these decisions.
I have a question. Charles, you speak about having communities and agencies having shared values to achieve these common goals, right? This holistic view. In any of your practices or the work that you've been doing, does it ever really involve, you know, industries and like the free market? I feel like they play such a heavy role in lobbying and pushing. Do you see efforts where industries have finally come and said, you know what, we want to have our business, but it's for the good of the people, and not only economically, but their health and the well-being of communities? Do you see that component playing
Yeah.
a?
I mean, I think, you know, a conversation needs to be had with business and industry. I mean, I think that, you know, you know, more are gravitating to understanding the need for, you know, environment and social sustainability type principles. You know, I think that there's a lot of decisions that get made way before you even get to, you know, the environmental permitting stage. That has to do with how you know, plan and the use of land, and those types of the siting decisions and things like that. And, you know, the engagement with communities at that point is really important. You know, as well as, you know, industry being a good neighbor in the real sense of the word, you know, and understanding them to be, they have a responsibility as part of being an integral part of the community. You know, they say that, you know, the one thing that we always try to get across to, particularly, I mean, to everyone, but particularly to companies, you know, is you don't engage communities when you have a problem. You got to build relationships that really engenders an understanding and trust. So can I ask a question? So I have posed before this question of, what do you mean by an equity analysis? When you use the term, what is in your mind as far as, you know, what that term means, equity analysis?
Chair Soto, if I may maybe start the conversation. This is Joel Miner. I'm the manager of the Environmental Justice Unit. So I'm not a member of the task force. I'm part of the staff of the task force, along with Lubna. And the Environmental Justice Act that we are collectively working to implement doesn't define equity analysis, but it does instruct the task force to consider including several different components in its recommendation about what should be in an equity analysis. Those include an analysis of how to avoid, minimize, and mitigate impacts for disproportionately impacted communities. It includes cumulative impacts analysis, and it does sort of highlight sort of a separate potentially requirement or thinking about an equity analysis or avoiding, minimize, or mitigating impacts separately in a permitting context. So from that, I think that we can glean that perhaps what the statute is contemplating with an equity analysis is very similar to many of the concepts that you mentioned, but ultimately it's up to this task force, all the members you see before you today, as well as those who are not part of the subcommittee, to make that decision of what an equity analysis is. So we've sort of called you here to inform what that might be. And
I
that we
mean,
can,
no, I think that's great. And I mean, the reason I was just curious, but I was also really pleased, you know, or heartened by the fact that you see the close link between equity and cumulative impacts, you know, and I think certainly, you know, when we start talking about, you know, what do we mean by all these terms in terms of things like disproportionate impact or cumulative impacts, they all fit into this pattern of how these forces are driving the concentration of burden into certain communities. And so, you know, to really get to the point where Beatrice was talking about doing something that's really transformative, you know, getting to that level is really, I think, really important. So I was really hard to hear you think about these issues in that way.
Mr. Lee, I have a question for you, Arthur Ortegon. Kind of gets along the same lines of what Ian was talking about. If like from Region 8 of EPA, that there isn't a uniformity to these terms and that this subcommittee and this task force can, I don't want to say just take liberties and define it the way we want. How can a lot of this excellent analysis be used in an effective way? Like I heard you, and what Ian kind of pointed out was that there are limitations to it being used in a regulatory kind of policy space. One of those kind of hit me is like, if we get to define it, these terms how we wish, how can we start to get that uniformity? I mean, once again, it's just kind of getting around the idea of like, this is awesome analysis, this is awesome information, but how do we weaponize it?
Yeah, I think that's not there's no simple, straightforward answer for that, I don't think, because, you know, cumulative impacts is by definition pretty complicated, right? Is a whole multiple set of things. And, you know, and so I think one of the questions that you know, we've been stressing, and this is a concept that's you know, in the risk assessment space, particularly cumulative risk assessment spaces, you know, is this whole idea of fit for purpose. Like, you know, you have to define what the question is that you're trying to inform. You know, and then you can bring to bear all the things that I just kind of mentioned, as well as other things that you can think of. So there's some examples. There's like at least one example of that you know I will point people to, which is one I did. But in that kind of regulatory space, and I'm sure there's, you know, we're getting calls to help work with, you know, within EPA and with you and with our state and local government partners to, you know, to try to utilize, you know, the tools that are available to start to make these to inform these decisions. In Chicago, one of the ways in which this kind of was brought together, I don't know if you guys know about this idea of health impact assessment, that, you know, that was like a frame for all these different types of analyses and information was brought together. Through that, you know, that has a series of basic steps to it. That serves as a pretty good framework for, you know, for making decisions, at least on a, you know, a community kind of site-specific level.
Thank you much for this information. Thank you very much for the information, Ms. Lee. You know, as I keep thinking of this and trying to formulate it in my own mind of how we approach this big task, you've mentioned a lot of things about Chicago and some urban areas. Do you see any differences in the urban versus the rural areas? And again, back to the question of fit for purpose, is there an element of fit for purpose that would change with the urban versus rural in your mind and your experience? Because that's something that I've kind of tugged on in my mind, is how do we treat how can we make sure that it's being utilized the correct way when a lot of the DI communities are outside of the urban areas as well?
Yeah, and I think we have far to go in terms of making sure we have the right information that useful for rural areas, the right ways of comparing communities or areas that's that's going to be appropriate for meaningful analysis in a rural context. Related to this, of course, are in a special type of rural context, which has to do with tribal lands and so I don't know if I can offer something more specific than that, other than to say the answer from where I stand and what I've seen is that it's definitely an important question and one that has to be addressed.
Thank you very much, Charles, and thank you so much for your presentation. I guess I'll go next with my question. My question has to do with, I was just skimming through the cumulative impacts white paper that Joel linked in the chat. And one of the sentences that I noted was, it lists a number of factors that should be considered in a cumulative analysis, and then says that the prioritization of those factors should be determined based on the community's prioritization of which factors are most important to them. And I wanted to probe that a little bit further in sort of how you think about engaging communities in that question, and how does one determine how communities should be engaged in determining prioritization, and sort of how you would go about doing that?
Well, I think one of the certainly engaging communities is an important part, and it's a central part, and it has to be a starting point, right? So like we have we with our colleagues at EPA say like in the development of a rule to really emphasize you need to get out and engage communities early on, even before you come up with a plan or what is called an analytic blueprint, that before then you have to be engaging communities to really understand these equity environmental issues. Because in large measure, given past history, if you don't do that, you're already formulating your problem in a way that doesn't really reflect community reality. So I think that's one thing. I think the other concept that's really useful here, we've in looking at EJ analysis, this whole idea of scoping. Say like you establish through some mechanism, whatever mechanism you want, that there are EJ issues and it requires an analysis of these potential disproportionate adverse impacts. Then you got to really be able to scope what is the problem, and then the kind of analysis that's going to be needed. And that's a bunch of things that go into that, not the least of which has to do with your authorities what authorities do you have to act upon which you can take action. But the other part of it is really engaging the community to reflect their sense of what the problem is. You know, like for example, one of the things from that Chicago study really, pointed out that even if, the impacts were just to be the status quo, it still perpetuates this history of communities already being overburdened. And so it perpetuates racial and social inequities. So, that was, and that reflects a lot of, I think, the problem formulation that really reflects how the community see the issue. Whereas I think a much more traditional articulation of the problem is, would be, so do these reflect any kind of levels of concern based upon some environmental standard? So this is what I think Beatrice was talking about when she said, that, this is an opportunity to think really creatively and transformatively about how we carry out our environmental protection mission.
Thank you, Charles. The first thing that comes to mind is do no harm. So we have to kind of segue onto our next presentation. Thank you very much, Charles, for coming today and having this very rich conversation. Is it okay if the task force has a little additional questions that we might be able to email you since we're kind of running out of time?
Absolutely.
Thank you. So that's another option. I know there were still some questions pending. So please feel free to send the questions to Lubna, and then we can all share and brainstorm together, kind of moving forward.
I'll be glad to share the presentation as well as some of the other resources that I was referring to.
Thank you. Yeah. Joel has done a great.
Beatrice, I think you just muted, so we can't hear you.
Oh, I was saying that Joel has done a great job of Googling everything really quickly and sending things over. So thank you again. So we're going to move on to our next presentation. We have a special guest, Ana from Pueblo, and she is also going to talk about an effort to do a cumulative impact analysis or an equity analysis in Pueblo that she would like to share with us tonight as well. Oh, sorry, I didn't know you were in Denver.
Yes, and the analysis is of some of the gas plants in Denver specifically, so not Pueblo. So sorry if I misrepresented that in some way, but hi everyone, thanks so much for having me. And I guess before I share my screen, just thank you for the work you're doing on this task force. Super thankful for the time and effort going into making sure that our policies are environmentally just and equitable. So really appreciate your time and expertise. And thanks for having me. I'm excited to share a little bit more about what we called an environmental justice review of the gas plants that are located in the Denver area that Xcel Energy uses to generate electricity. So is it okay if I share my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Let me just get organized and do that. All right. So are you all able to see my screen okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. So I've got probably about 15 minutes of content to share here, and then happy to do Q&A or whatever is helpful. If you all have clarifying questions or anything, please feel free to interrupt me. I can't see your faces now because I'm looking at the slides, but please don't hesitate to interrupt. So just a quick introduction. My name's Anna McDevitt. I go by she for pronouns. I work for the Sierra Club based in Denver. So I'm the senior campaign rep for our Beyond Coal campaign here in Colorado, but that kind of translates to working on a lot of general decarbonization and environmental justice policies in the electric sector for our state. My email is on here in case you all think of any questions that you'd like to follow up with, and please don't hesitate to reach out. So let's see, Beatrice and Lubna called me last week to ask if I could share a little bit about a report that we worked on at the Sierra Club last fall. The report was titled Xcel Energy's Gas Plants Threaten the Health and Safety of Denver's Community of Color. And as I mentioned, we called it an environmental justice review. I think it's probably similar to what you all are talking about as an equity analysis, but I'll let you all decide that. And I'll be sure to share these slides afterwards, but we do have a report summary in English as well as the full report in English and Spanish. We felt that was particularly important since most of the communities that we found that were impacted by these gas plants are Spanish-speaking communities. And so the 5 questions that I was asked to answer today, one sec, let me move all these faces that are blocking my slides. So why and how did you conduct your analysis? What data did you draw from? How did you choose demographic and equality indicators? I kind of combined those questions. How did we bring that together in order to draw conclusions? What would have been some of the resources and tools that could have helped us through some of the challenges that we face in our analysis? Really excited to answer that question for you. And then how can agencies benefit from this? And so I'm just going to jump right into starting to answer those questions. And as a part of this, I'll also provide an overview of the report and what we found. And if you feel like I don't directly answer any of these questions, please let's talk about those afterwards too. So this was all inspired because at the time that the state of Colorado back in 2020 was going through a stakeholding phase to figure out how we in Colorado would meet the greenhouse gas reduction goals that were set out in House Bill 1261. There was an analysis by physicians, scientists, and engineers for healthy energy that found that Colorado's coal and gas plants are disproportionately located in communities that have a high share of people of color, as well as low income people compared to the state average. And so this slide gives you a snapshot of that. I just took a screenshot from the report. And you'll notice that there's a lot of coal and gas plants in this upper right quadrant, which indicates a high population share that's below the poverty line, as well as a high population share that is what the EPA calls minority population, or at least they define that as the sector of the population that's not white alone. And so you'll notice a couple of facilities that you maybe have heard the names of up in this upper right quadrant. Specifically, there's the Martin Drake coal plant, which folks might be familiar with. That was a coal plant in downtown Colorado Springs in the middle of a low-income community called the Mill Street neighborhood that there was a decades-long fight to close and finally stopped burning coal last August, I believe. You'll notice the Cherokee gas plant up here. This is the one that we'll talk a little bit more about today. There's also the Arapahoe gas plant here, as well as many others that are in parts of our state. And we wanted to take a microscope and look a little bit closer at what these circles actually look like for communities. And so about the same time that we were looking at analyses like this, the Sierra Club was doing listening sessions in parts of North Denver to better understand how we could support community efforts to reduce pollution. One of the things that we learned is that a lot of people thought that the Cherokee gas plant was part of Suncor. So the red and white smokestack that you'll see a few pictures of later on in this analysis, folks thought that that was part of the Suncor oil refinery, and it's not. It's actually the second. It's one of the biggest gas plants in the state. I believe it's the second biggest gas plant in the state. And so we were getting a lot of questions about what does that mean? What does it mean to have a gas plant in the community? And we wanted to be able to answer those questions. And then the third thing that kind of, I guess, inspired this was at this time, the city of Denver is trying to figure out how they're going to meet their 100% renewable energy goals. They have a goal of reaching 100% clean energy by 2030, as well as a goal of reducing their greenhouse gas emissions 100% by 2040. So those are some pretty big goals. And it was pretty clear that there's 2 gas plants that probably stand in the way of those goals, and additionally in the way of some of the city's new equity-focused goals. And so we wanted to help answer some questions about what these gas plants mean for the communities within that context as well. And then lastly, I'll mention that the Cherokee and Arapahoe gas plants, when you look at out of all of these facilities that are gas plants in the state on this chart here, the Cherokee gas plant is the last gas plant that's slated to still be operating in the state of Colorado. It has an expected retirement date of 2055. That's later than any other gas plant in Colorado. And so we wanted to know what does that mean? Are we planning to burn gas and other fossil fuels in parts of the state that are low income and do have high people of color population shares? How does that match up? And so we wanted to look at that as well. So these were the questions that we wanted to answer when we started looking into this. So one, we wanted to know, what does it mean to live next to a gas plant in Denver? And what is the pollution that's coming from those gas plants? We wanted to know who lives near the gas plants in Denver. And we wanted to know how community demographics, the gas plants and the area pollution levels compare to the rest of Denver and the state. One thing that we weren't really planning on doing as part of this analysis was a cumulative impacts analysis. But as we looked at the existing data that we had at our fingertips, it was pretty clear that we couldn't talk about what these gas plants mean for Denver communities without talking about all the other pollution that is also in these communities. And so that kind of ended up being a part of the report that we just couldn't ignore. And so when I say Cherokee and Arapahoe, these are the gas plants that I'm talking about. So this is a map of the 3-mile radius around each of these gas plants, which is what the EPA uses to look at compounding pollution factors. Here's the Cherokee gas plants. Technically, there's 2 of them. Cherokee 4 used to be a coal plant and is now a gas plant. That's one that I think you all heard about in your last environmental justice task force meeting for having an illegal permit, since it didn't do what should have been the required NAAQS modeling for its nitrogen dioxide pollution when it was fuel switched and when that permit was issued. And then over here, we've got the what we call the Cherokee combustion cycle plant. So this is new. It was built in 2015. It's the 2nd biggest gas plant in the state, and it's right next to this other one. And so combined, the pollution from these 2 gas plants makes it one of the major polluters of nitrogen dioxide pollution, for example, in the Denver metro area, alongside the Suncor oil refinery. And I think the other one is the airport, the Denver International Airport. And then we have the Arapahoe gas plant. This is in the Sun Valley community, specifically the College View neighborhood, if you're familiar with this part of Denver. And it is, it's a peaker plant that doesn't run very much. It was also fuel switched from a coal plant to a gas plant, similar to Cherokee 4 up here. And here's the 3-mile radius around that plant. So these are the gas plants that I'm talking about when I walk through what we looked at to conduct our environmental justice review of who lives around these plants and what they mean for the Denver community. We found 3 things from the report, and I'll dive into each of these a little bit more specifically as I go on. So the 3 main things we found were, 1, that the Denver gas plants do pollute the neighborhoods they're in, and that those pollutants are harmful to human health. The second thing that we found is that the gas plants are disproportionately located in low-income communities of color that have higher than average health burdens, as well as higher than average rates of COVID-19. And then the third main thing we found is that these gas plants in Denver are located in parts of the city that are already disproportionately impacted by many other sources of localized pollution, as well as by climate change. They have really high climate change vulnerability. And so to give you an idea of what each of these things looked like and what data we used to get to that conclusion, we looked at some of the main criteria pollutants coming out of the gas plants that are in Denver. And so these charts I just pulled directly from the report that shows how many pounds of nitrogen dioxide pollution they have and what that ranks them among the state's gas plants. And so notably NOx and SO2 pollution is pretty bad for human respiratory and cardiac health, particularly for children and the elderly and those with pre-existing conditions. But these pollutants are linked to cardiac and respiratory problems, causing asthma attacks, sending people to the emergency room, et cetera. The state rank we figured out by looking at the 19, so there's about 30, there's a little over 30 gas plants in the state of Colorado. 19 of them report their air pollution for these pollutants. So that's what we used was the rank for those 19 gas plants. And notably, as I mentioned earlier, the Cherokee gas plant in North Denver is one of the biggest polluters in the state when it comes to NOx. Here's some of the data that we use to look at who lived around the Cherokee and Arapahoe gas plants, or who lives around them. So we used EPA's EJ screen, which I think you guys just talked a lot about. I didn't get to catch the full presentation, but We used EJ Screen to look at who lives within 3 miles of each of these gas plants, and found that they have higher shares of people of color than most parts of the state. They have a higher low-income population than most of the state. The folks who live within 3 miles of the gas plants are more linguistically isolated than most of the rest of the state, and there's more people with less than a high school education than the rest of the state. And so you all can, I'll let you all look at this table to kind of understand those numbers, but the gray is the state average, and then the red colors are the population share within 3 miles of those gas plants. And notably, in case it's helpful to hear that information shared another way, when you look at Cherokee specifically, it has a higher people of color population share than 94% of the rest of the state of Colorado. When you look at, linguistically isolated folks, the people who live around Cherokee are within the 91st percentile for the entire state of Colorado. And so it's pretty clear that at least in Denver, these gas plants are disproportionately impacting low-income communities of color with higher, who are also low-income, just isolated and have that less than high school education. If it's helpful to see this in a visual form, that's what we have on the right side here. We use the 2018 American Community Survey results to look at that. That survey is run by the census, but it's just annual, and it's used to inform policies to allocate funding to our communities on an annual basis. And so it's not quite as robust as the census, but it gives you a pretty good idea of who lives where. So that's the data that we used for this visual representation. You can see the folks who live around Cherokee and Arapahoe are majority Latino folks. And actually, this was outside the geographic scope of our study, but if you look over here to the right, to the parts that are in orange here, that's another, Xcel Energy has another gas plant there called the Blue Spruce Station, I believe. That's also located in a community that's majority Latino. Here are some other demographics that we used to look at that. Here's a map of the median household income of Colorado, and you can see that the gas plants are in parts of the metro area that have a lower than average median household income. Again, if you want to look outside the geographic scope of the study to where the Blue Spruce gas plant is, you can see that there as well. I would love to better map out where the rest of the gas plants in the Denver metro area are to see how that impacts, but that's just not something that we looked at as part of this. And then I mentioned that we found that folks who live around the gas plants have higher than average health burdens than the rest of the state. And so here's the data that we used for that. This one was a little bit tricky. So we use CDC data for this, but it was specifically for, the report was specifically for, I think it was the 500 different cities, metropolitan areas across the country. So there wasn't statewide data for these things. This was metro area data. So that's what we were able to look at here. And you can see the areas around Cherokee and Arapahoe have slightly higher asthma rates, high blood pressure, diabetes, and cancer rates, at least for the Cherokee gas plant, not necessarily for the Arapahoe gas plant, as you can see right there. And then I mentioned the third thing we found in the study is that the gas plants are located in parts of the city that are already disproportionately impacted by so many different sources of localized pollution and climate change. And this is the part of the study that we just really couldn't ignore. And so this is from the EPA's EJ Screen, and EJ Screen looks at a bunch of different environmental indicators of populations within a 3-mile radius. And you can just see that the population around the Cherokee and Arapahoe gas plants is just, it's in the highest percentile in the state of Colorado for most of these environmental indicators that the EPA uses. And so, in case it's helpful to kind of say this a different way, when we say that the Cherokee gas plant is in the 94th percentile of the state for particulate matter, it means that that community has more particulate matter pollution than 94% of the state of Colorado. And so that's what this is showing you, is that this community is just tremendously overburdened by sources of pollution in pretty much every way that the EPA calculates them, from ozone to air toxics risks to traffic proximity, risk management plan proximity. So that's proximity to facilities that have dangerous chemicals and require risk management plans in case the community is exposed to them, things like that. I want to point out a couple of things. So one is, when you look at ozone pollution for the rest of the state in Colorado, you'll notice that that's kind of where these facilities and the population around them ranks the lowest as far as state percentile. But that's specifically because the state of Colorado has such horrible ozone non-attainment problems compared to the rest of the country. So for example, I wrote it down somewhere, but when you look at Cherokee, so that's that 50%, they're around 50% for the state percentile for ozone. They may be in the 50th percentile for the state, but that puts them in the 91st percentile for the entire country. So the area around Cherokee has worse ozone pollution than 91% of the rest of our country. So that kind of helps you put things into perspective when we're looking at these pollutants on a statewide basis. And the last kind of data point that I wanted to highlight here was looking at vulnerability to climate change specifically for these communities. And so this is data that the city of Denver put together in a climate equity analysis that's extremely helpful. As you can see from the corner here, they used a bunch of data from, ranging from municipal data to BLM, EPA, it's all listed right here. But you can see the areas around the Arapahoe gas plant, which is right down here in this bright red census tract, and then the Cherokee gas plant, which is up here in this bright red census tract. They have the highest vulnerability when it comes to heat, and that uses a number of different indicators ranging from things like impervious surfaces, tree canopy in these areas, vehicle access in case they need to get away quickly, elderly population share, and other health factors. So that's how the city of Denver came up with this map. And these circles just represent the census tract population share, in case that's interesting to you. But we can really see that the areas around the Arapahoe gas plant and the Cherokee gas plant are going to be disproportionately impacted by climate change as temperatures rise in our communities over the coming decades. And so to more directly answer some of the questions that y'all asked, I wrote out some of the main data sources that we use to come to these conclusions. So they're all listed for you right here, but I also, and I'll go back a little bit, I made sure that the data source was at the bottom of all of these charts in case that's useful to you. And in order to answer the question, how did we bring all of this together in order to draw conclusions? We just answered our questions directly. So the sections of this report, those 3 sections that I mentioned, were literally just the answers to those 3 original questions that we asked, and we decided that this was something that we wanted to spend some time looking at. And then when it comes to what else would have been helpful, I mean, I'll be the first to admit there's shortcomings to this analysis, right? We just looked at what existing data was here that was easy for us to get to better understand what it means to live around a gas plant in Denver and then what the communities that do live around gas plants look like. But there's a number of things that we didn't get to look at, and I kind of listed some of those out here. One is air toxics monitoring. So notably the EPA's toxics release inventory, which looks at the release of toxic chemicals from specific facilities. It doesn't require anyone to report air toxics from gas-fired electric generating units. So coal plants have to do it, but gas plants do not. So for example, we know that in Pueblo, the Comanche 3 coal plant is responsible for 84% of the air toxics releases in the Pueblo area. We don't know what percentage share that is for any gas plants in Pueblo or in Denver or anywhere else. The other thing that's that's missing here, honestly, is just a quantitative analysis of health indicators in the communities around the gas plants. It'd be really great to know what the cost of these health indicators are on a local community. So that as we have transition discussions or make decisions about what energy transition looks like in our communities, we can understand, what the cost of that is, if we're saving people money, et cetera. The third thing that I kind of noticed was there were some discrepancies between state level versus metro area health data. I kind of mentioned that when we were looking at that CDC data about health indicators within the census tracts around Cherokee and Arapahoe gas plants. So that was a little bit incomplete. We couldn't do a state level analysis there. And then the last thing is, I think if we're going to have hard conversations about what environmental justice and equity analysis looks like in our communities, we need to have the full picture. So it'd be great to have facility level local tax revenue and employment statistics. So specifically understanding the impacts of polluters on our communities. Are the employees at these facilities living nearby the plants? What role does the facility play in the local community when it comes to tax revenue? I think having that big picture will be really important as we see our communities changing to better protect health and safety of the people who live in them. And then lastly, to answer the question, how can agencies better benefit from better understanding the environmental issues communities are facing from analyses like these? Notably, this is an analysis that specifically at a facility level looks at the communities around 2 gas plants, right? I mentioned there's 30 gas plants in the state, and then, so many other pollution sources across the state as well. But I think the findings from this report are indicative that we have a lot to benefit from if we require more comprehensive equity analyses for Colorado communities. And that would have benefits for every corner of the state and would give agencies like the PUC, like the AQCC, CDOT, more tools to ensure that equity really is at the center of decision-making. And I can think of 4 specific things that would be really useful for. 1, permitting new facilities. 2, reviewing and reopening operating permits for existing facilities. The citing of projects and utility resource planning, and then informing economy-wide decarbonization efforts across multiple different agencies.
De proyectos y para coordinar entre varias agencias. Cuando digo algo como la planificación de recursos, 2 de las instalaciones más grandes están repasando una evaluación con el EPC. Sería muy útil saber si en la fase 2 de estos procesos regulatorios, como bien propone el sitio de nueva planta de gas, queremos ver si eso va a añadir a las cargas ambientales a las que ya se enfrentan las comunidades con impacto desproporcionado. Esto no es algo que se haya hecho en un plan de recursos, por lo menos en cuanto a lo que yo sé, creo que sería extremadamente útil. Mientras alguien como Excel Energy propone...
That's just an example. And then I'll just add that I think...
Solo es un ejemplo y solo quiero añadir que pienso que llevar a cabo algún análisis
as part of permitting processes should just be required, but especially in disproportionately impacted communities and especially in non-attainment zones across the state for criteria pollutants. So for example, the Northern Front Range, Denver metro area, non-attainment zone for ozone. I think this would be something that would be really helpful in my opinion. So that is all I've got. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and answer some questions if you guys have any.
Hi, this is Doug Dean at PUC. I was just responding to your last statement there about resource planning at the PUC and whether or not the commission considers disproportionately impacted communities. Historically, they haven't, because that was not put into the statute of something we need to require until just this last legislative session.
Right, and I'm really excited to see how it plays out. And I think requiring some kind of, requiring specific things as part of a comprehensive equity analysis would be really useful as part of phase 2. So I don't think as far as I know, it's not clear exactly what that will need to look like in phase 2. But both of those processes are coming up pretty quickly here.
I think folks who have their hands raised can just come off mute and ask their question.
I think I raised my hand. Thanks, Anna. Sorry, my camera's off. My internet's bad, but I had a chance to, look at this as Anna was producing it, and I do think it is a great document that's moved us forward. I just want to acknowledge a few limitations that I think are in there. One, the TRI database, we've seen polluters go back and change that years later. That actually happened last year while we were fighting for the creation of this task force in the first place. And so I think some of those databases, how often they're updated, how accessible, also make a challenge, at least from a data access. And then I've been working with the CU Public Health School to try to get an analysis of other pollution sources, right? Like this isn't taking soil, and this isn't even talking about water. She's just talking about the air pollution at this point. And so I think what kind of a data is available there is critically important. And, you know, the I-70 settlement resulted in the kickoff of a study with Colorado State is doing now that is trying to build off the kind of research that Anna and others have done, that we're doing with the CU Health School to show an even more comprehensive plan that brings in these other layers of pollution. But I do think those databases have flaws that we need to be aware of as we look to them as well, especially the self-reporting component that we've seen be reversed on our communities.
Now, and I didn't know if you wanted to respond or if you want me to jump in next.
I'll just quickly agree with you, Ian. I mean, I think it would be great to have more resources to better do this kind of comprehensive analysis. And we just worked with what was easily and readily available for us. But, you know, I think I've seen in the chat already in this meeting, you know, references to the need for better community modeling. And I think that would be great. I think if we could have more resources to better understand how these compounding pollutants are impacting parts of the community, it would give us more of what we need to better understand how these facilities are impacting our communities.
Thanks. So I wanted to ask, you know, building on the conversation we were having earlier with Charles about just how, you know, challenging and important it is to scope the analysis, right? So either like as this task force is trying to figure out like what should the scope of an equity analysis look like, or, you know, for agencies if they're doing it, like what's the scope of it? So I was just wondering if you could speak to like how you decided, or Sierra Club decided, the scope of the analysis that you did, and then also the part of the conversation about like were you able to get community input on those scoping decisions?
So a little bit, we talked to some partners that are actively doing a lot of community organizing and listening in North Denver to understand, like that's how we came up with those questions that we wanted to answer that I kind of mentioned, those three main questions. Most notably, what does it mean to live next to a gas plant? Like, what is that doing to our community? And so that was the extent of the community input that we did. We were just trying to answer some questions. I think there is a lot more we could have done there. And if we were to do something more extensive, I would love to partner with more organizations. You know, we did reach out to a number of organizations also to just fully partner on this analysis, but it was just clear that people didn't have the capacity to work on it at the time. And I know that's, you know, always an issue just because we're facing so many different layers of pollution and fights in our communities. And then I think the other part of your question was just how do we decide on the scope of, do you mean specifically the 2 gas plants or something else?
No, I think more about like the analysis that you did of the plants, right? So the other the slides that came after that, sort of after deciding, you know, which facilities you were going to focus on, or like how, you know, deciding what impacts to look at.
We just looked up everything we could find about the 3-mile radius around those plants, that it felt like we could compare at a state level to better understand if the communities around the gas plants look different from the rest of the state. So the things that we were able to really hone in on were census tracts, because you could kind of tell what might be within the 3-mile radius and obviously what census tract the gas plant itself is in. And you probably noticed we relied on a lot of EPA data for most of that because a lot of it is already in the EJ screen. So this ended up just being mostly an EJ screen analysis of the 2 gas plants with additional health indicators that we were able to find from the CDC. And we were able to kind of, you know, we realized as we looked more into what the different health impacts could be from the plants, that there was a lot of data out there about how COVID-19 was impacting the communities. And so we ended up bringing that in because we felt like we couldn't not include that since we knew that information at that point. So we kind of just used everything we had, or that we felt we had at our fingertips. which I think speaks to the need for better monitoring so that that information is accessible to people like me who live next to a gas plant and are trying to figure out what that means.
Thank you very much, Anna, for your presentation. I thought it was really informative. I apologize in advance because I think my question might be a little bit overbroad, but wanted to ask it anyway. So as I believe we've discussed on this subcommittee before, the equity analysis is really the first step, right? The idea or the hope is that these analyses will then go on to really inform and be incorporated into agency decisions. So I wanted to ask, in your ideal world, how would the PUC then incorporate analysis like yours into their decision making and into, in particular, regulatory proceedings such as ERPs?
Yeah, good question. So, you know, the PUC has the hard job, right, of balancing a number of different factors and making a decision about what they are going to require a utility to do. And that ranges from environmental policies to reliability, to cost, to labor standards and protections, and all sorts of things. And I think that this needs to be a part of that, right? Like equity analysis needs to be one of those big things, one big buckets that are considered when the PUC looks at different portfolios, for example, that are put forth by utilities. So, for example, we're about to get a phase 1 decision from the PUC on Xcel Energy's resource plan. And then phase 2, for folks who aren't familiar with resource planning, they're gonna look at where new facilities are gonna go. Where are the new wind turbines gonna go? Where's the new solar panel facility gonna go? And the other thing that they're gonna look at is where will new gas go? So right now, Xcel has proposed about 1,300 megawatts of what we call dispatchable resources. A lot of that is modeled like gas and could potentially be gas, but we won't know that until we see what kinds of bids Xcel gets from companies to build new resources to help power our homes. I think that when we look at a set of different portfolios, we should be looking at the siting of these facilities and an equity analysis of what those facilities mean for the surrounding communities they're being proposed in. And I think that should be part of what the PUC weighs when they require utilities like Xcel to move forward with specific portfolios. So for example, there's always a conversation when we're building new gas about, is this a new gas resource or are we adding it to existing infrastructure? Existing infrastructure would help save money for customers because we wouldn't be building a whole new gas plant. But if adding more gas to an existing facility such as Cherokee or whatever means that we're adding more NOx pollution to an already tremendously disproportionately impacted community, that really needs to be considered and, in my opinion, avoided as part of resource planning processes. So that's like a really specific example, spoken from someone who lives by the Cherokee gas plant, would hate to see more gas out of there as an example, but I think that's the kind of thing we could use this sort of analysis to look out for and avoid in things like utility resource planning, but also in processes at the Air Quality Control Commission regarding new facility permitting or reviewing and issuing operating permits for existing facilities that just have to get their next Title V permit or whatever it is.
Let's go ahead to Renee's question, and then we're going to take a quick break. I think what we can do here, Anna, as well as if anybody on the commission has additional questions, we can send those over to Lubna, and then we will all get an opportunity to see the questions and the answers as well, if that's okay with you.
I have a couple quick questions. The first question is, did you notice any glaring data gaps in your analysis, in equity analysis? One of them that I always use is the US Census doesn't cover Indigenous communities very properly, both urban and rurally. And another question is, have you and how can we help working, especially in this space going forward, with some cultural sensitivity in data industry as an allies also to disproportionately impacted communities context? because that should also be a part of equity analysis. It is disheartening hearing Arap or Comanche, just different names of these stations, and then knowing, especially personally, the historical context of Indigenous communities to the state of Colorado. So if we are really going to be transformative in equity analysis, that means also being allies to disproportionately impacted communities context, even in our data with cultural and trauma sensitivity. How have you, and what would you like to see in that space? Sorry, that was kind of a loaded question too.
That's great. Those are both great questions, and thank you for them. I'm going to answer the first one, and then I have a clarifying question about the second one. So as far as data gaps go, I think a couple of things. One, I don't know, I mean, you'll notice that the information that we were able to share about specifically what pollutants were coming from the gas plants were specific to some criteria pollutants that we, usually have information for related to, polluters. And that was, that's NOx, SO2, and then we also did carbon dioxide as well. We don't have that air toxics data. And I think especially in a community where there's already a lot of concern about the air toxics coming from the Suncor oil refinery, it'd be really good to know what that looks like coming from the second biggest gas plant in the state that is a mile away from the Suncor facility. But we just don't have the answer to that question. I don't know what is coming from the Cherokee gas plant when it comes to air toxics. So that's a pretty clear one. And then more on the demographic side, I think it'd be really interesting to know what, how am I going to say this? I don't know how you'd conduct this either, but energy use. It'd be really interesting to know if the people, how much energy people who live within 3 miles of the Cherokee gas plant are using when it comes to electricity use compared to other parts of the state. Because again, that could be indicative of like wider, richer communities that, potentially use more electricity. I don't know. Getting their energy from a facility that's in a community of color that is low income, that potentially isn't using as much electricity. And I'm saying something like that based off of a lot of assumptions about like, the size of my house in that area compared to people in the Denver metro area who probably have a lot bigger houses in the suburbs. I think it'd just be really interesting to be able to better understand that in the same way that I know people talk about the Suncor oil that goes to the Denver airport. A lot of the folks that live around Suncor aren't using the airport as much as people who don't live anywhere near Suncor oil refinery. So those are just a couple of things that come to mind to answer your question, Renee. And then to revisit the second one, sorry, the way my brain works doesn't allow me to remember both questions at the same time. Can you repeat it?
Thank you so much, yes, for the first part, and just for your presentation as well. How can we move, or how would you recommend moving as allies to disproportionately impacted communities context, the name of these plants, what has been done to Indigenous communities just in that context alone, in that population alone?
Yeah, the name thing is a huge issue. I will say Xcel Energy has a bad habit of naming their fossil fuel plants after Indigenous communities. And we see that all across the state. A number of the coal plants that Xcel is thankfully planning to retire by the end of this decade were names that were stolen from Indigenous communities. And then, we have seen an effort with related to the coal to call some of these things different names. I think it'd be great to do that for these gas plants. I think it'd be great if we can find a way to work with Xcel Energy to rename these plants even as we retire them so that we're not perpetuating that harm. And then I think it'd be great to, outside of just the name thing, Renee, I wonder what it could look like to really center community engagement and listening in impacted communities in any of these regulatory processes that are going to in any way use comprehensive equity analysis. Kind of like how I just kind of pulled together everything we could possibly find to do an environmental justice review of these 2 gas plants. How can we at this state agency level do a better job of including communities in figuring out that analysis? Does that kind of answer your question?
Yes, thank you. I appreciate that. Just because it would help, like I said, with DIC context, but honestly with community modeling and protections going forward with that cultural and trauma sensitivity. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Anna, and thank you. I don't think Charles is online anymore, but We just want to invite everybody, if you guys have more questions, please let Lubna know and we will continue this conversation offline. So I think the idea is that we're going to take a 6-minute break, right, Lubna? And then we're going to come back and see Joel's presentation around the survey and some of the information the agency shared with us.
Awesome. Yeah, sounds good. So quick 5-minute break and then we'll see folks back here at 5. Thank you, Anna.
Gracias, Ana.
Awesome. Great. I think most folks are back, and folks want to just come back on camera or just indicate that you are back so we can go ahead and get started. Thanks, Ilda, for the thumbs up. Great. So, well, Joel, I think the best way to do this is maybe just to have you go ahead and frame instead of me kind of introduce the topic. So I will go ahead and turn it over to you to go ahead and get started.
Thanks, Lubna. And just, can you give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen? Okay, great.
Yeah, and sorry, as a reminder, just for folks in general, and Joel will kind of do a bit of a presentation and then we can open it up for discussion and Q&A. But as you are speaking, please just remember to speak slowly and avoid using acronyms for the interpreters, which I'm realizing is going to be really hard for us to do during this portion of the presentation. Lots of acronyms. But yeah, please remember to speak slowly. Thank you.
Thanks, Lubna. And I will actually try to say the full name or a shortened version that's actually a word wherever possible throughout this presentation to make it a little more accessible. So as Beatriz mentioned at the beginning of the meeting, at the last subcommittee meeting, you all suggested that we do a survey as your staff, the EJ unit, to learn a little bit more about just really the full scope of decision-making authority that different agencies who work in the environmental context have. So we did that. We worked with Beatriz and Renee as co-chairs to develop a survey that we administered a few weeks ago. The response deadline was just Friday. We actually have heard back from nearly every agency that we administered the survey to, and we didn't get, unfortunately, much time to collate the data in sort of a helpful way. So there is a spreadsheet on the Google Drive that shows all the responses to the survey. I believe Lubna will put a chat link to where you can find that if you'd like to see sort of the full response data. We have kind of spent some time over the weekend just collecting it to get it ready to present here. But one of the questions we'll pose at the end is how can we present this data in a way that's a little more user-friendly so you all can really delve into it more as the task force and kind of keep working on the data now that we have it. So again, we did administer the survey to sort of every state agency that has some sort of role in the environment. So those include 4 divisions within CDPHE, the Department of Public Health and Environment, 4 division, the Colorado Department of Transportation, the Colorado Energy Office. We did send the survey to the Colorado Lottery and Great Outdoors Colorado because of their role in outdoor equity and in sort of our outdoor spaces. We did not hear back from them yet, unfortunately. The Department of Agriculture, many different divisions within the Department of Natural Resources, which is sort of the other agency that has a large impact on sort of the environmental regulatory sphere, in addition to the Public Health Department. We heard back from nearly all those divisions. I heard on Friday that Colorado Parks and Wildlife just needed a little more time, so I think we'll hear from them soon, as well as the Public Utilities Commission, and then the Outdoor Recreation Industry Office, and the Office of Economic Development and International Trade. So very happy that we were able to get all those responses in such a short period of time. One of the questions we asked, as you all know, is sort of most agencies and really all state agencies in Colorado have what is called often a bifurcated model, where there are staff of the agency. So just as for the task force, Lubna, Natalie, and Rosario and we are your staff, and then a board or a commission that kind of plays an oversight role or actually develops the policy. We sort of asked all these agencies what all the different boards and commissions they work with for. I'm obviously not going to list it out, but you can see it's quite a few, and it's often more than one for each agency. So it's worth keeping in mind that just as the staff of each agency are often working with maybe different boards and commissions when they are working on a rulemaking as opposed to an enforcement action or in sort of different substantive areas of their work. And note that this includes both type 1 boards, which are boards and commissions that have things like regulatory and permitting authority, as well as type 2 boards, which are advisory boards like you all, the task force, that can't necessarily issue a rule or make a permitting decision, but still are charged with making decisions for the state, perhaps advising on policy matters like you all. So we did ask questions about rulemaking authority. I did my best to sort of collect it on this very wordy slide to condense all of the really great information we received. So the slideshow has a little more condensed. If you'd like to see the really complete responses, those are in the public Google Drive as well. You can see that there's really a variety of areas where different agencies exercise rulemaking authority. At CDPHE, it's really about environmental quality, so air, water, soil, and radiation pollution and how that can affect our health. In natural resources, DNR, it's more about the use of public resources like water or wildlife or oil and gas or minerals. And then there are also things that are sort of in between in other spaces, and not all agencies have rulemaking authority. That would be another highlight I would take away. Agencies like the Colorado Energy Office, the State Forest Service, and the Outdoor Recreation Council don't exercise regulatory authority. In terms of enforcement authorities, most agencies have authority to enforce their own regulations, as well as sort of the statutes, and then those that issue permits, the terms of the permits. But again, not all agencies have an enforcement role. So you can see in some agencies that make rules, like the Water Conservation Board, actually don't have an enforcement authority. But for the most part, rulemaking authority and enforcement authority were sort of paired. For permitting authority, again, most of the type 1 agencies that work with the type 1 commission do have that permitting authority and issue permits. You can see basically a full gamut of activities that across the economy, as well as sort of different impacts that are permitted, right? So at CDPHE, the Public Health Department, we often permit for impacts. So air impacts, water pollution, discharges, and then potentially sort of impacts that could pollute soil or sort of discharge to groundwater from a hazardous or solid waste facility. Whereas in DNR, there tends to be permits for types of activities, right, in the Department of Natural Resources. So things like oil and gas at CDPHE, mining, or sorry, at the Oil and Gas Commission, mining within the Division of Reclamation, Mining and Safety, weather modification for the Water Conservation Board, and then sort of water well construction within the State Engineer's Office or the Division of Water Resources. We did sort of ask about other types of authority that agencies exercise. Some of them answered yes, and you can see there's a wide range of things here, from sort of establishing rates for use of state trust lands to many decisions that the Public Utility Commission makes, including the electric rate cases that we were hearing about for our electric utilities during Ms. McDevitt's presentation. So there were definitely some things that didn't fall neatly into that regulatory, rulemaking, enforcement, and permitting dichotomy that we often use in our jargon. We did also ask about what we would call planning or policymaking authority. As you can see, many different agencies actually issue or work on plans that sort of shape policy or how resources are allocated. So one example is many of the agencies work on the greenhouse gas reduction roadmap. I think I didn't use its full title to save room on the slide, but see the Air Division, Colorado Energy Office, Public Utilities Commission, and the Department of Transportation all work on that greenhouse gas roadmap. Another important plan that's worked on by multiple state agencies is the State Water Plan. The State Forest Service works on the State Forest Action Plan. And then the Department of Transportation works on many plans. In addition to the greenhouse gas roadmap, that's often how it makes decisions. So the statewide transportation plan, regional transportation plans, and statewide transportation improvement plans. So you can see those.
A nivel del Estado y también regional para mejorar el transporte, y también estas agencias intervienen a pesar de que no crean permisos pero ellos sí que dan forma a algunos de recursos donde están situados. También hemos preguntado sobre autoridad que emiten ayudas y proyectos que dan ayudas económicas.
Anything in between. And really most of the agencies had some sort of grant making or sort of funding function, which are listed out here, and sort of how those funds are allocated is really important. I think we heard from Mr. Lee earlier that is sort of one of the potential uses for something like Colorado EnviroScreen, right, is identifying disproportionately impacted communities where funds can be spent. That's also kind of parallel to the work the federal government is doing with the EJ40 initiative of investing 40% of resources in what the federal government calls disadvantaged communities. And you can see we do a lot of that similar sort of grant making process and spending money at the state level as well. We also asked which agencies have a definition of disproportionately impacted communities. Most do not, but some do. And some, like the Department of Agriculture, have sort of analogous definitions of related terms that might not necessarily be disproportionately impacted communities, but are still relevant in this context. I did want to share a slide that we've actually prepared for the disproportionately impacted community definition subcommittee that kind of has a little more definition detail on each of the definitions that are used by different state agencies that have a definition of disproportionately impacted community. Answer more questions there. This has sort of been our big focus in that subcommittee, is fleshing out this definition slide, and it's available both in this presentation as well as in the definition of disproportionately impacted community folder on the Google Drive. We also asked which agencies are currently conducting equity or environmental justice analyses. And I think, we may have this idea that we're starting from nowhere, we're starting from scratch, but actually a lot of agencies do conduct this type of analysis or something related that they filled out on the form. So the Air Division, for example, has guidance on health equity and environmental justice and permitting that guides its permitting processes, as well as the climate equity framework that many of you are likely familiar with, that's been developed by the climate program over the past few years. The Colorado Energy Office is currently conducting an electric vehicle equity study and recently released an energy affordability study that really are equity analyses. The Department of Agriculture sort of collects and analyzes a lot of relevant information when it relates to grant awards, and can call on Jordan to explain more about that later. He, I believe, filled out the survey. So thank you, Jordan. Many of you on the call did fill out the survey for your agencies. The Oil and Gas Commission conducts an alternative location analysis for proposed new oil and gas development plans, which are essentially new oil and gas facilities within disproportionately impacted communities. The State Forest Service uses specific project criteria in areas with what it calls areas with fewer economic resources, which they've sort of identified using a social vulnerability index, and they take that into account in some of their project planning. The Colorado Water Conservation Board has convened a water equity task force to make recommendations on the state water plan and in local water planning projects. The Division of Reclamation, Mining, and Safety participates in federal National Environmental Policy Act analyses that often includes sort of an equity, or what they would call an environmental justice analysis component. And as you heard earlier, the Public Utilities Commission doesn't currently have a process for this, but it's working on developing one under Senate Bill 21272. So there is kind of a lot going on that we can draw on already in state government in the work of this subcommittee. Finally, we asked about agencies conducting a cumulative impacts analysis. And so some agencies do, some don't. The Air Division does consider cumulative impacts through modeling. So when it does a modeling analysis for a permit for a new source of air pollution, which you all heard about through the Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility letter that was submitted to you as a public comment, that is sort of inherently a equity or a cumulative impacts analysis, rather, because it has to take into account other sources of emissions that are already in the area. So in sort of the background levels. The Department of Agriculture has discussed this. I think the Oil and Gas Commission probably has the most robust cumulative impacts analysis process from the state agencies that responded to the survey. So they do require that alternative location analysis for new facilities in a disproportionately impacted community. And they actually have a form, they call it a Form 2B, cumulative impacts analysis, that they use to collect sort of a whole suite of estimated of data about estimated impacts for proposed oil and gas development plans. They then store that data in a database and analyze it annually through a report to the Commission and the public, and that sort of allows the agency to look over time at whether facilities are being concentrated in communities of color or low-income communities. And sorry, I forgot to mention that as part of that alternative location analysis, an operator has to provide information about existing oil and gas facilities, as well as sort of permitted but not yet built oil and gas facilities within the area where the permit is proposed, so that there is the ability to get that comprehensive picture of all the infrastructure in an area, which is sort of how they conduct that cumulative impact analysis through the alternative location analysis. We actually have a typo. I apologize. I think I repeated the answer for the last slide for the Forest Service, so we will correct that in the public version. And then finally, the Division of Reclamation and Mining and Safety does conduct cumulative hydrologic impact assessments for watersheds to ensure that there's no harm to the environment or local communities, I believe, as part of their hard rock mining permitting process. So they do that cumulative impacts analysis for sort of water resources. So that was the information we received in the survey at a very high and fast level. As I mentioned earlier, I did want to sort of present the question of how else should we present this information to you? Would you like sort of a different analysis or a different format to make the information from the survey more accessible? Again, we don't have much time to put this together, but we could do more before the next subcommittee meeting. One option that we sort of put together as an example is we could present the information sort of like this with like an easy to read slide for each agency, though that makes it a little harder to compare across agencies. So we could also think about ways that we could easily present the information to compare across agencies, or maybe the answer is what we presented is great and we don't need to do anything different, but we're certainly open to doing additional analysis of the data and presenting it later if that would be helpful. So I will stop my screen share and see if there are any questions from the task force.
Thank you, Joel. I don't think it's a question, but more of an observation of kind of after Charles, you know, how conversation of how these all intersect and how, you know, we identify how these different agencies are impacting disproportionately impacted communities, like through maps or as well. I just, it's big, right? It's a lot anyway, but my head is spinning.
Yes, I'll just say mine is too, right? Even as a lawyer who has worked in this space for a long time. And I think that, I believe last meeting, someone used the term power map, or maybe we talked about that in our, the meeting with the co-chairs, to you and Renee to plan this meeting. And the idea of a sort of power map is a structure we could use to sort of present this idea differently. You know, it is a lot to digest, and sort of one thing is, you know, we could also look at industry sectors, right? Like there are multiple agencies that regulate things relevant to, for example, the oil and gas sector or the gravel mining sector. We could sort of present which all agencies make decisions about that, or decisions related to forestry. So we have the State Forest Service, but there's also the Air Division that regulates prescribed burns. So I think if there are sort of other ways or structures that we could present this information to make it a little more digestible and sort of less overwhelming, not just for the task force, but for community members, I think we're really open to it. We can think about that. And the answer is, you know what, we'd rather you as our staff spend your time on something else. We can also, we don't have to do more than what we already have here, but we're really open to suggestions and how we can present the data differently. Ian asked a question about whether there is a way to check for permits by zip code. I think we can look into that. I know that the Oil and Gas Commission does have a database that's sort of searchable by zip code that would show where there are existing permitted facilities as well as proposed permits. I'm less sure about sort of specific public health department databases off the top of my head, but that's a great question.
Yeah, I just think about that as like an ease of use and trying to understand power dynamics. If you are in a community, of understanding what permits are happening and then therefore which agencies you would need to engage in to change them. I have a second question, and that was, I was looking at this a little bit, but I told you my computer's slow in the Google sheet that is. But did they attach procedural rules or policy documents that they use to guide their decision makings? And if not, I wish that they would and highlight any equity language that is in there, because coming again from being a council secretary, I recognize that the procedural rules / bylaw / policy are the bedrock places that we would probably want to layer in equity provisions in order to change outcomes.
Yeah, so Ian, I may have misunderstood your question earlier. We did not ask the agencies to attach procedural rules or ask them about their own procedural rules in the survey. So I'm sorry if I misunderstood that. I thought you were talking about the actual like if there were citations to the types of regulations themselves sort of substantively. So no, we didn't do that as part of the survey. Is that something that you think?
Yeah, it's something that I would recommend to the co-chairs as like a follow-up, because again, I think those places are important. And in the conversations we've had with the AQCC and Water Quality Control Commission, just laying out places in which we would probably likely to engage to get ahead of the engagement process. Procedural rules has come up time and time again.
And then Joel, I had my hand up to kind of react to or kind of engage in the earlier part of your comment or question, Ian, about, I think I understood you asking, like, is there a way to search by zip code to understand kind of like all of the permits that might be at play within all of the state agencies? And I'm not aware of any kind of combined database. So like if we were to look back into that, it'd be looking probably like specifically at each division, even within each agency, of whether or not it's possible to search by zip code. But I don't think that we have any kind of like comprehensive statewide database of kind of all permits that are up for decision in any particular geographic area, not at this time.
Yeah, I also see that as a tool for the people who work in the government, right? Because if you're going to be going to try to do an analysis, you would know exactly what other things are in play.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just react to that and say I think that's a really interesting idea for, you know, want to even put into it, you know, even as an idea for the first version of EnviroScreen, but that could be something where Colorado EnviroScreen, our interactive environmental justice mapping tool, goes in the future. Right now, it's more like the sort of California model that Mr. Lee was discussing earlier, but that is sort of an idea that has come up in some of the public engagement around EnviroScreen as well. And you're right that if the task force recommends that multiple agencies conduct an equity analysis, those agencies will sort of need to know who else is conducting an equity analysis in this area and what are the sort of types of projects that could be contemplated under other agencies' jurisdiction. So I think it's a really valid point. That's sort of part of the resources that agencies might need to sort of complete the equity analysis. And sort of to that point, and what Tyson just put in the chat, I guess I would pose a question to all of you. The purpose of this that you all directed us to create this survey and get this information is obviously to inform part of the charge of your subcommittee, which is what agencies should be required to conduct an equity analysis and for what types of decisions, right? I'm paraphrasing there, but that's sort of the component of your scope of work that's relevant here. And I guess maybe a question for you all is, does this provide enough information to sort of be a baseline to inform your recommendations on those questions? Or is there like additional information that would be helpful for us as your staff to kind of gather before the next meeting? We've heard about the procedural rules, but sort of any other information that you think would be useful for you to have at your fingertips as you think through those really, as Tyson said in the chat, really complicated questions.
I have one more, and that is, this comes to the institutional knowledge of people who work in the agencies. I think that everybody through their time has probably encountered an issue that a community has brought forward. And I think that kind of gathering of information of like examples of when the environmental justice community has engaged with them and what their feedback was, I think could be really powerful too.
Thank you, Ian. That's a great point. And actually, Beatriz sort of suggested something similar in the co-chair planning meeting for this meeting. So Lubna and I are actually already working on sort of soliciting some of that just institutional knowledge from other agencies of just sort of have there been a lot of engagement from communities of Colorado low-income communities about an agency's decision, and sort of could we even bring forward some of the written public comments or other recordings of public comments that were provided about those decisions to this task force to consider and review as part of your analysis. So we are actually working on that already, but can certainly continue working on it, and if you have other specific ideas beyond what I just said, we would love to hear it, so we can kind of keep getting you all the information you need in the course of untangling this really complex area.
I'll admit I'm still absorbing all of this information, sort of thinking out loud, but a couple points that, you know, that come to me initially in terms of information that might be useful from these agencies. Yeah, I think it would be interesting to see what the agencies identify as the environmental justice impacts of the regulatory or permitting decisions that they make. So they've outlined the sort of overall decisions that they are responsible for in one of the columns. And then they've also outlined whether or not they are responsible for conducting an equity analysis. But even if they are not currently responsible for conducting that analysis, what do they see an equity analysis looking like in their domain if they were to conduct one? And what decisions would they be looking at, and what impacts would they be looking at? So I think it would be interesting to get some feedback from them on that question, and that could inform our thinking going forward. And then also, you know, even if not a formal equity analysis, what efforts have they made to start engaging environmental justice communities, if any? I think a question on that would be useful.
That may also be something that the the community engagement subcommittee can be tasked with too, is gathering other information on how other agencies have reached out and to these communities and how they've been able to communicate thus far, understanding that from our standpoint, it has not been good enough and or adequate in many cases, but understanding where the baseline is would help us as well, I think, in our recommendations going forward.
Thank you, Tyson. I kind of had the same idea, which is I think there obviously is a role for community engagement in an equity analysis, as we heard from both Mr. Lee and Ms. McDevitt earlier. And you all have a big mission already, so I think we can think about as your staff coordinating. Actually, we have Hilda here, the chair of the community engagement subcommittee, but whether that's sort of something that subcommittee can look at and bring forward or bring here. But Mira, I think to your first point, it's a really great follow-up question, and we can think about sort of asking it. I'm slightly hesitant to ask all of our agency partners to spend their time filling out a second survey, but I think we can at least try to coordinate. There are obviously task force agency representatives from nearly all of these agencies, and we can try sort of coordinating with those task force members to gather that information. If you all are okay with that, Jordan, Doug, Trisha, others on the call, and then if we're not able to, do some individual follow-up before the next meeting. So it's helpful to know that would be sort of a useful idea, is not just what are you doing now, but where do you see these environmental justice or equity factors factoring into your decisions. I believe we are at time, so if there are no further questions, of course, you all know how to contact me and Lubna, and we welcome kind of any additional ideas you have in the middle of the night, or if you're taking your kids to school tomorrow and you think of another question you think we should be asking, or a way to interpret the data in a more user-friendly way, we're always open to it. So please don't hesitate to follow up. And I will turn it back to Beatrice. Thank you.
You want me to hop in, Beatrice?
Yeah, I think we're tag teaming here. So Renee is taking over.
Hello, loves. This is the public comment section. So I wanted to go ahead and open this section for public comment, and I'll call on people in order of when your hand is raised. 5 minutes per comment, unless it feels we have the flexibility to keep it going. So please try to be mindful of each other. And I see no hands raised. So is there any public comments?
I couldn't get a hand. Oh, sorry, Velma. I'm sorry. This is Chandra with Pierre. Yeah, I just did a thank you hand because I couldn't find the hand raised. Sorry.
Do you want to go ahead and go first and then Velma, or Velma, would you like to?
Go ahead, Chandra.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Oops, sorry, let me take that off. So yeah, thank you guys for having a public comment period. And I want to thank Anna also for presenting that incredible amount of information. That's been really useful for the rest of us, I think, in the community to use, and also hopefully for you guys. And the scope of what you're doing, Joel, is amazing. It's huge. And so what I'd like to talk to you guys about again is one small piece of what you're doing, which is to reopen. Our request is to reopen the Cherokee permit and recommend to CDPHE that you do modeling and develop a monitoring plan for that area. So I know you have kind of bumped that issue to this task force, to the, and so I wasn't sure if you guys had more questions about it or not. And I'm not exactly sure how the makeup of this task force is different from the makeup of the action task force. Just looking at the names, it seems to overlap a lot. But as you know, the air in Colorado is not getting better. And Pierre has really been focusing on EPA and getting EPA to look at the state's issues, because nobody at the state has been making any of these difficult decisions. And so you guys, you're a new group and are outsiders to the state agencies, and you really have the ability to make some change here. So I didn't get to talk last time about the difference in modeling and monitoring, I don't think. And I think that that's really critical to understand, because modeling can be done before a facility is built. And that will determine the amount of pollution that will probably be created. And so they can, at that time, before the facility is built, they can say, these are the scrubbers that you want to put on, and this is how often you want to run them. Or maybe you can't even build it here, although they've never said that. You can also do modeling after a facility is built, and you can see where most of the pollution is. So that will allow you to determine where to put the monitors. And I know that that is a focus for the state legislature, that they've set aside a lot of money for monitoring. And I think that that will be something that your group will be talking a lot about. I know you're trying to do a lot of forward thinking work and how equity can be included in decision making, but you don't want to forget about the things that have already been done, like permits that have been issued that maybe you can go back and request they be reopened. And I would suggest that you do that as anytime, sooner than later, and not just wait for your report and recommendations to go to the governor's office. And I'd like to answer any questions you guys have about these issues. Yeah, I just wasn't sure exactly how it fit in with the task force, the subcommittee.
And Joel, can you just comment on the process that we must go through in as far as the recommendations and going on a go forward basis? Because I think I get confused too on what the scope of our ability is as well sometimes.
Certainly, and I'm sorry I go off camera sometimes if I'm not speaking. By the way, I'm still listening. I'm our note taker today, and I don't want you to all see the side of my face while I take notes. So I'll Tyson, I'll answer your question, and then I'll also try to quickly answer Ms. Rosenthal's question, and just say that this is a subcommittee of the task force. So it's you see many of the similar faces because it's actually many members of the task force are on the subcommittee. It's our largest subcommittee. So Tyson, to answer your question, sort of what the task force process is, the Environmental Justice Act tells you all, the task force, to develop recommendations on a number of topics that would be submitted to the governor's office, to the General Assembly, and to CDPHE. It gives you a deadline for that, which is November 14th of this year, so 2022. It does not, in sort of our reading as your staff, with sort of consultation with our attorney in the Attorney General's office, Emily, who is was with us earlier. I believe she had to leave the meeting for a parent-teacher conference, so unfortunately isn't here to answer questions. Contemplate sort of making additional recommendations outside of that sort of final recommendation process. As we discussed during the last meeting, though, the issues that Ms. Rosenthal is raising are very much within the scope of what the task force is asked to address in its recommendations, and specifically in the kind of subparts of your scope of work, the Environmental Justice Act, that this subcommittee, the Equity Analysis Subcommittee, is charged with addressing, which is sort of how, whether, and when to do a cumulative impacts analysis, which could certainly include modeling. I think Ms. Willie, or Robin, I'm sorry, I try to use first names for task force members so you all get to know each other better. Robin is not, I believe, a member of this subcommittee, but as she sort of said during the last task force meeting, it seems like the Air Division is really open to the task force making recommendations about the subject that Ms. Rosenthal raised, of sort of when the Air Division should reopen permits to conduct additional modeling or monitoring in a disproportionately impacted community, to sort of inform the rulemaking that the Air Division is going to propose to the Air Commission for 2023, which is sort of a rulemaking contemplated by the Environmental Justice Act. So certainly that's sort of one way that the task force could address the ideas that Ms. Rosenthal is bringing forward in your final recommendations. So I don't know if that answered your question or answered part of it, but not all of it, or was a too detailed answer, but I hope that kind of helps you understand where sort of we as your staff view the process outlined in the Environmental Justice Act, and where Ms. Rosenthal's suggestions fit in.
Yeah, and I'd just like to make a comment that that's their interpretation of the act. And I think another interpretation is that you guys can submit as many recommendations as you would like. And I would really think that the Attorney General's office would, I would be really surprised if they said to you, sorry, we're not going to look at this recommendation. I mean, it's coming from the Environmental Justice Action Task Force, and action is part of your the charge of your group. But thank you.
Thank you. Velma, do you want to go next, please?
Okay, thank you. I really appreciated the presentations today, particularly as they applied to trying to develop the components of an analysis, which, as I understand it, this subcommittee is sort of not doing the equity analysis, but trying to describe what a thorough and comprehensive equity analysis would be, and how to the agencies that might need to use it. And so as I said in the chat, in looking at permitting, but also at enforcement, as we know, there's massively inequitable distribution of siting of pollution sources in our communities all across this country, ranging from trash dumps to highways to factories. And unfortunately, very little data and information, surprisingly little data and hard information about those those sources of pollution and also the content of the pollution. And so, and because our permitting system is based on the upside down notion that we're trying to figure out how much pollution to allow in our communities without causing harm, we're in the position of having to figure out, of requiring harm, of essentially, as I say sometimes in talks, requiring a body count in order to be able to restrict pollution from going into our communities. So as I thought about what would go into an equity analysis, I particularly was impressed by Charles's presentation and Anna's as a practical demonstration of what it takes to try and do an equity analysis. So when we look at, I think it's vital that because of the upside down nature of our regulatory system, if we're going to be equitable and have our communities be equitably treated in our regulatory system, we have got to include cumulative impacts. We've got to include multi-pollutant cumulative impacts and also multi-factor impacts that are not usually thought of as environmental situations, but other disparities, food, economic, racial, education, because they interact with the pollution and with the environmental quality, but also they constitute the additional burden imposed on the communities by the pollution. And public health and occupational health in particular are factors that have to be taken into consideration in an equity analysis. And once you have those impacts identified, well, the identification of what I mean to say is once you identify which cumulative impacts you want to be in a good comprehensive equity analysis, that should be incorporated into the modeling, which is going to require looking at how modeling is done and how factors are incorporated. And as we all know, modeling is most effective when it's supported by data and solid information. And so this is my last point, which is the third point in a comprehensive equity analysis that I would see is to the extent that it's available, solid information, such as information about existing pollution sources, and if there is any monitoring data. But, and I will just conclude by saying that those latter 2 points, information about pollution sources and monitoring data, and data about the communities with the other factors in the communities are essential to having the modeling into which the equity analysis is going to be utilized, or which will be utilized in an equity analysis, is very important. And at least as far as pollution sources are concerned, very difficult.
Por lo menos en cuanto a las fuentes de contaminación, es muy difícil obtener esto. Hasta en una sola agencia específica, yo diría que es casi imposible porque tenemos un proyecto.
here in Pueblo, and for our meeting a couple of weeks ago, I went looking for the permits for the known polluters in our community. And I went up one side and down the other of the CDPHE websites and have yet to be able to find even one of the permits to be able to then try and track down the mandatory pollution monitoring from even one of the polluters in our city. It shouldn't be that hard. When we're talking about data that's going to be used to affect the health of our communities, it shouldn't be that hard. Knowledge is power, and people in our communities need to be able to access the knowledge about us. I would say modifying the slogan I heard about research, no research about us without us. I would say no data about us without us. And so that's, but I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you. I like that. JD.
Yo estoy aquí otra vez. Bueno, a todos. Let me send this real quick. I've got a few things that I wanted to say, but one thing that I noticed, well, a couple of things that I noticed that I'd like to address if I can, is when they're talking about the equity or environmental justice, and you're talking about all these entities that are supposedly the trademarks, they're given the gold standard. When you consider an entity like Xcel Energy, you got to remember their history. They're used to actually within each community, they would have these little centers that they actually were like service centers, and they had people you can pay the bills and things. Well, now they're all closed. So if you look at rural areas, there's nowhere that they can go. And then almost all the employees now are contractors or they're contract workers. So when they're touting jobs and things of this nature, what this entity is now is specifically just an entity that skims off the top and it leaves all this stuff on the bottom. So todo estoy aquí. So there's these things that are happening that they're talking about, these entities that are put in the spotlight, that they're really something. In reality, they're just scams. And so if you notice the email that I put in above, and I really think, and all you have to do is just listen to what the comment had that was made about Xcel Energy. And this guy, he's actually a part of a libertarian group and such. When you have folks like this that are recognizing the disparity within these industries, I think it's important that this group take a look at some of these corporations and see what role they actually play in the demise of this entire system. That's one thing. And another thing that I would like to also bring up, yeah, and I'm just trying to think because there was a lot to get in here. So I'll just go back to my next email so I'm not keeping you all night, because I want you all to know, I really don't think I'm being a pain in the pants. I may be a pain, but this is all meant to be. And this next link that I just sent here, I really would suggest that everybody take the time to watch these videos. And I know we're all busy, because believe me, I'm busy too. One day I was on 3 Zoom events in one day. So I get it. But part of this entire endeavor is to educate yourselves in these efforts. We've got to address the actual root of the problem. And so as we're evaluating this and we're actually trying to figure out, see the analysis of where this is all happening from, we need to understand what's actually happening within our own realm, within the actual realm of why the disproportionate and people are actually handled the way that they are, because there isn't an actual effort that's been pushed forward. And we need to recognize that. And then again, so when we actually produce all this and give it to the people that are actually trying to do this, you have to actually give reference to. You can say we can actually do this and this, understanding that there's a big group of people that are pushing the narrative as we go forward. And then with that, if you guys have any questions, just let me know and I'll just let you guys go. Yeah, this is a big picture, and we need to take a look at it at a different angle. And we really do need to change status quo. Everybody's getting frustrated. Oh, the last thing I'm going to say, just so you guys know this. No, I won't say it. Never mind. I'll tell you about a friend arming herself at a later date, because this thing's really happening and it's getting serious, my friends. And it has everything to do. It has everything to do with environmental injustice, because people are seeing how this entire system is rigged. And I'm getting, well, I say this every time and I don't mean to. So I guess I will say what I was going to say. I have no faith in our government at all, not one bit. But this, I believe, this group that I'm talking to right now, I think this is our last hope, because here we're given an opportunity to address some of the issues that we're being confronted with. And after this, toss away. And I really believe it, because, you know, Biden's not really addressing these issues. And this is the first time where people have been given an opportunity to raise their hand. And Renee, también, I can't tell you how much I appreciate when they're talking about the naming of all these entities that are actually harming us. And they're my ancestors, they're everybody's ancestors here. You know, so I'm really looking at you, and that's why I keep being on this meeting, on these groups. I really believe in my heart of heart that this is our last effort right here. And si lo puedo. Although, Sandra, we'll be going, I'm with you guys to the end on this, okay?
Thank you, JD. Thank you for all of your educational context as well, and for understanding that aspect of community and bringing it to this space with the bravery and the humility that you do. I'm really grateful for you.
También.
Coming up to the end. Oh, sorry, please.
No, también, that's all, no.
Can you also email some of those links? Because I was trying to copy and paste it and I can't get it out of the chat.
Yeah, I will. Can you guys put those in the minutes? Because I appreciate
Yeah.
those going to minutes.
Yeah, they're in the minutes. We've been pulling everything from the Zoom chat, and the minutes, just so everybody knows, are on the public drive, where we were initially putting like the minutes in a different place and then kind of editing them and then moving them over to the public drive. But moving forward, we're just gonna put the minutes directly there, so you have access to them live.
Thank you. Thank you, Joel. Thank you, Lubna. You guys rock. It's a lot. So yes, we are coming up to time. Is there any more public comments?
Yeah, if any others want to share, and also just in these last few minutes, if there are any task force members that just like care to share any reflections or anything in our last few minutes, we welcome that.
While we're pausing, maybe we can also take a moment just to thank Maite and Yasmin for the wonderful interpretation today. This meeting is also recorded in Spanish and should be a great resource for community. So thank you, Maite and Yasmin.
I just want to take a minute to let people know that also EPA 8 Region 8 is forming an environmental justice roundtable. It's meeting this week. So if you want to be invited to that, let me know. And then they're actually going to be coming and taking a tour of North Denver Commerce City on Friday, I think in connection to the whole EJ40 movement. But I just want to make people aware that EPA is also committing more resources to this effort simultaneously.
Sorry, I just realized I was muted.
Unmute.
Yeah. So yeah, if there are any other folks that want to share any announcements or anything, I welcome you. Otherwise, if anybody wants to make a motion to adjourn, we can do that as well.
I will make a motion to adjourn.
Second.
All right. Well, great. Thanks, everybody. Renee and Beatriz, thank you so much for your facilitation. Charles and Anna are not here anymore, but thank you, Joel, for your presentation and gathering a ton of information in a very short amount of time. That was no easy undertaking. And thank you all to our task force members for just staying engaged throughout this whole process. And as we said, all of the materials for today's meeting can be found on the Google Drive. If you have any issues in like navigating that, I'm happy to hop on like a quick video call and can walk you through kind of how it's organized if it's troublesome for any folks. But we've tried to make it as simple and straightforward as possible. And then, of course, thank you to everybody who provided public comment today. Our next subcommittee meeting, definition of disproportionately impacted communities, is taking place on Thursday, 4 to 6:30. And we're lining up some great speakers for that as well. And then our data and health disparities subcommittee meeting is taking place next Tuesday from, let me double check, 3 to 5 p.m. So just some quick announcements. Thank you again, everybody, for your time. And we look forward to seeing many of you on Thursday.
Thanks, everyone.